In this video, we're going to talk about an overview of torts, what constitutes a tort. A tort basically is a civil wrong. It's not a breach of contract and it's not a criminal case. This is a lawsuit where somebody claims that somebody else's conduct fell short of what a reasonable person would accept, and ultimately they were injured and now they are required to get some sort of damages. So before we jump into the specifics of torts, some famous tort cases, some you may have heard of. The big one from the early 1980s involved Ford Motor Company. When Ford put out the Pinto, which was a subcompact, smaller car that was being made by Ford, one of their smallest ones. What happened when it was put out to the public is that if it was rear-ended by another vehicle traveling at approximately 30 miles an hour or more, the gas tank would rupture and the car would burst into flames. And this was occurring. And in one particular case, a woman by the name of Lily Gray was driving her car on a California highway. She was pulling off, she was merging into another lane, and she was rear-ended. And the car exploded, and she ultimately died of her injuries, and her passenger was a 13-year-old who suffered disfigurement and burns and had to endure a number of operations. So the families sued in a tort action against Ford, products liability in this particular instance. We'll talk more about the specific types of torts, but sued for their injuries. Ultimately, a jury awarded $2.5 million to the woman's family and about $600,000 to the Grays in damages, but overall they awarded punishment damages that we call punitive damages to the tune of $125 million. That was ultimately reduced by an appeals court to $3.5 million. Ford wanted the punitive damages tossed out altogether, but the court said that Ford had knowingly endangered the lives of thousands of Pinto owners. It came up in the trial that the internal documents of the company showed that Ford secretly crash tested the Pinto more than 40 times, and they knew that the fuel tank would rupture at speeds over 25 miles an hour, but they did not change it or fix it to be cost effective. The company felt that it would be cheaper to pay out settlement lawsuits than it would be to stop production and fix the problem. And clearly that did not help them out. In this particular case, there were other cases that came afterwards, but that was the biggest one. And notably, with this Ford Pinto case, this was the first time an American company was brought up on criminal charges as a result of this kind of conduct. Another famous tort case you may be aware of is the McDonald's hot coffee case. A woman by the name of Stella Liebeck, she was 79 years old, and she claimed that she was burned from McDonald's coffee as it spilled in her lap. The claim is that the coffee was too hot or dangerously hot. She endured 3-degree burns over 16% of her body, near her inner thighs and genitals. The skin was burned away down to the layers of her muscle and the fatty tissue. She was hospitalized for 8 days. She required skin grafts. Her recovery lasted about 2 years. So she sues McDonald's, offers to settle the case for the expenses, the medical expenses, which were around $20,000. The company refused, and they offered her $800. So the case went to trial. Jurors saw photos of her burns. They heard expert testimony as to how hot McDonald's coffee was. In fact, McDonald's coffee was 30 to 40 degrees higher than coffee that's served at other companies. There was also testimony that hundreds of other people, including kids, were burned as a result of them having their coffee so hot to about 180 degrees to 190 degrees when other places were heating their coffee to about 160 degrees. And I'll note that home coffee makers are between 135 and 150 degrees. The company McDonald's knew that its coffee was burning people, but they seem to not really care about that fact, apparently. So jurors ruled in her favor, and she was awarded $200,000 in what we say compensatory damages. I'm going to talk more about that in a later video, but that's for her actual costs, medical costs, pain and suffering. The court ultimately reduced it to $160,000 because they found her at fault as well. She could have used more care, so they reduced it. But ultimately, $2.7 million in punitive damages was awarded by the jury, and they felt that that $2.7 million amounted to 2 days of revenue for McDonald's in coffee sales. Just in coffee sales alone, that was how they calculated $2.7 million. But again, the judge reduced that to about $500,000, and then ultimately the parties settled on an amount that was undisclosed. Some of the rumors is it was about $500,000. Anyhow, two big famous cases. There are tons of tort cases that go on from day to day. A typical car accident case would be considered a tort case. Somebody slips and falls in a store, that would be a tort case. Another famous case involves Erin Brockovich, if you've ever seen her movie, when she takes on Pacific Gas and Electric litigation on behalf of her town. She does an investigation because people in her town, an enormous amount of people in her town are dying of cancer, and she tracks it down to Pacific Gas and Electric litigation and the wastewater. They're discharging this chemical into ponds of water on their property, which is seeping into the groundwater and making its way to the town's drinking water. Ultimately, that case resolves for $333 million, which at the time, which was 1996, was the largest settlement ever paid in a direct action lawsuit to that date. There have been some bigger ones since then, and oddly enough, involving Erin Brockovich, but nonetheless, a tort case. So let's get into it. So let's talk about torts. It is a civil wrong, as I said earlier, not a breach of contract. It's not a criminal case. It is based on wrongful conduct. So through this area of law, the idea is that society compensates those who have suffered injuries as a result of the wrongful conduct of others. These are actions between private people, private corporations, a person against a corporation, and we are going to focus on here business torts, torts occurring only within the business context. What we will be covering: intentional torts against person, intentional torts against property. We're going to discuss what is negligence. You may have heard that term before. There's actual elements that need to be proven in order to be successful in the case of negligence. And we're also going to talk about this concept of strict liability. The basis of tort law recognizes that some acts are wrong because they just cause injuries to others. We can have intentional actions, we can have negligent actions. We're first going to talk about intentional torts. And the factors that come into play when we're looking at intentional and torts include a wrongful act. You need somebody to act in a wrongful way. They knowingly or intentionally commit that act. They knew or intended the ultimate consequences that come of that act, or some consequences to come as that act, and those consequences interfered with another's interest. It could be they were injured, so their interest would be free from having injuries. It could be their property was ruined or trespassed upon in some way, and that affected their interest. So the first set of intentional torts we're going to talk about are those that are against people, and our intentional torts are going to start in our next video.